Thank you. Half a day and good evening. The Committee on Education, Air Transportation, and Statistics, Research, and Planning will now convene this informational briefing. Today is Thursday, August 15, 2019. The time is now 5:13. For the record and in accordance with the Open Government Law, public notices of the hearing were sent to all senators, stakeholders, and main media broadcasting outlets on Wednesday, August 7, 2019, and a second public notice on Tuesday, August 13, 2019. The agenda for today's hearing includes the following items. The Guam Department of Education with a status update on Public Law 34-105. That was the law that changed year of 180 instructional days to hours, and also addressing Guam Education Board Resolution 2019-10, which addresses a further change to Public Law 34-105, and to discuss interscholastic sports. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize my Vice Chair, Senator Shelton. Thank you for being here. The purpose of this informational briefing is to give GDOE the opportunity to provide a status update on Public Law 34-105, as well as a discussion on Resolution 2019-10, and that is the first one we'll entertain today. So I'd like to invite any stakeholders that this is pertinent to, Mr. Superintendent, perhaps the Deputy Director, Mr. Sanchez, some of our board members, if you'd like to come forward, please. Thank you. Okay. So to discuss the status update on Public Law 34-105 and the current Guam Education Board Resolution 2019-10, I'd like to open it up to members of the board initially, and then perhaps you can just state your name and your position for the record. Thank you.
All right. Hafide, honorable senators, we greatly appreciate the opportunity to come before you on behalf of the Department of Education. And it's great to have sessions like this where we can present and ensure that all our stakeholders, and especially our elected leaders, have an understanding of the policies and procedures that have been set forth by the Department of Education. As you mentioned, we have resolutions that we've submitted that basically have a chronological order of how we derive our decision. And with me, I have my colleagues that will introduce themselves. But just for public consumption and the way the board is structured is we have committees that hold work sessions that have the stakeholders within the department, management all the way up to individuals that may be affected by the policy change that have an opportunity to come before the board at the work sessions. And from the work sessions, then they forward it up to the board for consideration of any actionable items or information. And usually in the past it was through motion, but we've adopted a way where we kind of provide a historical background of how we've come to solving some of the issues and challenges that's brought forth to the board, and that's where the resolutions come for. And that's where we ask, therefore, be it resolved in terms of what the action of the board is trying to accomplish. And so with me, I have my colleagues here and two new board members that have been entrenched in trying to, carry on the baton, if you will, in terms of what's going on with the Department of Education. We just had our first day of school not too long ago, and we're excited. There's a lot of good things going on in our schools. There's a lot of teachers that are excited. And so to have this opportunity to come before you to present, we appreciate you calling us and asking us, and this is where I believe the dialogue will be healthy. And if there's areas in which we can improve our policies and procedures, and definitely I know that our board will be, will consider a lot those chain of conversation and dialogue. So with that, I'll turn it over to our board members to introduce themselves, and then I believe the chair of our committee, which will be addressing the resolution as it pertains to hours and minutes, will have a statement. All right? Introduce, and then you can start.
Oh. You want me to just start? Okay. Good day, Madam Chair, Senator Shelton, and members of the public. My name is Lourdes Benavente, and I am the committee chair for the Guam Education Board's Curriculum Committee, the committee that oversees the school calendar. Thank you for the opportunity to provide my remarks and comment related to Public Law 34-105, which was signed into law on June 5th, 2018. To begin, I, along with my fellow board members, are appreciative of the efforts of Senator Joseph Augustine to address the matter of instructional time in our public schools and the intent of Public Law 34-105. During this past school year, over the course of our implementation of the law, it was brought to our attention that there is a difference in the language that addresses elementary and secondary schools with regard to how it addressed instructional time. Upon further review, it was confirmed that this difference in the language created a discrepancy in the required amount of instructional hours for secondary schools versus elementary. To discuss this, the board and GDOE management convened the Joint Board Calendar Committee, which is comprised of administrators, teachers, GDOE management, and representatives from the Guam Education Board and the Guam Federation of Teachers. What resulted from this meeting was a recommendation from the committee to the board that it pass a resolution expressing specific recommendations to bring the elementary and secondary instructional minutes in line with the current practice, board policy, and current board union contract. In response, the Guam Education Board passed Resolution 2019-10 supporting the identified changes to the law, which would then effectuate a consistent number of instructional hours required by both elementary and secondary schools. With me today also are members of the committee, and GDOE management will be able to answer any specific questions. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide my input.
Good job.
Good evening, Madam Chair, Madam Vice Chair, Senator Marsh. I'm here to testify on Public Law 34-105, and I thank you for the opportunity for me to be here today to share my concerns. My name is John Birch, and I'm a member of the Guam Education Board. And the concerns I have that I'm sharing with you are mine and mine alone, and may not necessarily be the position of the Guam Education Board. And while I do not profess to be an expert on contract laws, my understanding of the contract clause of the United States Constitution is that in general, states may not obstruct or alter the terms of a contract once that contract has been agreed to. But while this applies to state legislatures, it does not necessarily apply to the courts. Therefore, it is my contention that collective bargaining agreement between the Guam Federation of Teachers, AFT Local 1581, and the Guam Education Board for GDOE teachers supersedes the current law, Public Law 34-105, because it was ratified approximately 7 months before the public law was enacted. However, the collective bargaining agreement is a 5-year contract, and it will eventually expire. All negotiations for a new contract will then have to be in compliance with the public law, making it imperative to review the impact Public Law 34-105 will have on our public schools. My first concern was whether or not the time-based references in the collective bargaining agreement and Public Law 34-105 conflicted with the Carnegie unit used for measuring educational attainment by American universities and colleges. The Carnegie unit is 120 to 180 hours of class or contact time with an instructor over the course of a year at the secondary level. The upper end of this range, 180 hours, is usually appropriate for lab science courses, while 150 hours is the average for a year-long academic course such as English or history. A good rule of thumb is 50 minutes a day, 5 days a week for 36 academic weeks, or 180 days for 1 credit course. The lower end of the range, 120 hours, is fine for elective courses. Every secondary school student will have to study the 5 core academic subjects: English, math, science, languages, and geography, or history. I could not find any conflict with the time-based references in either the collective bargaining agreement or Public Law 34-105 with the Carnegie units. My next concern was to identify what was the actual intent of Public Law 34-105. In general, I believe the intent is to make up lost instructional time due to students being released early from school for various reasons. In terms of hours, by converting 180 instructional days into equivalent instructional hours. In short, elementary 180 days times 5 hours a day equals 900 hours of instructional time per year. Secondary 180 days times 7 hours a day equals 1,260 hours of instructional time per year. But Article 1B9 of the Collective Bargaining Unit defines instructional time as that time when a teacher has the assigned responsibility for students. Teachers are not generally held responsible for the time students are released for meal periods, recess, breaks, or for proceeding to their next class. Therefore, I do not consider these periods of time as instructional. I reviewed the GDOE bell schedule for 2018 and 2019 school year, and I don't think any changes have been made for the current school year that we just entered. To determine whether or not the GDOE time-based references are in compliance with both the Collective Bargaining Agreement and Public Law 34-105. In general, I found that the elementary schools are running similar bell schedules, not including recess and lunch breaks. All of the elementary schools are exceeding the mandated 900 hours of instructional time prescribed by both the Collective Bargaining Agreement and the Public Law 34-105 for the school year. The elementary schools are also in violation of the CBA by exceeding the instructional day by 13 minutes or more. Article 1B8 of the Collective Bargaining Agreement defines instructional day as the time from the beginning of the school's first class until the dismissal of the school's last class, 7 hours for secondary, 6 hours for elementary. This administrative error should be reviewed and corrected by the GDOE and the GFT. In general, I found that the middle school bell schedules are similar as far as middle school starting at 8:30 a.m. and ending at 3:30 p.m. But the similarities end there. Each school has its own unique bell schedule, as well as number of classes offered each day. In comparison, the only similarity between the high school bell schedule is that they indicate a 7-hour instructional day, the exception being JP Tours, which exceeds the mandated 7 hours by 45 minutes. While the general outline of the secondary school bell schedules indicate a 7-hour instructional day, the time references within each bell schedule do not add up to 7 hours or 420 minutes. I'm assuming the difference may be attributed to uncounted breaks between classes where students are released to proceed to their next class. And while this is in compliance with the Collective Bargaining Agreement mandate of a 7-hour instructional day, it would not be in compliance with the public law's mandate of all activities of 7 hours of instructional time each day. Under the Collective Bargaining Agreement, instructional day includes all activities from the start of the school day until dismissal at the end of the school day, while Public Law 34-105 specifically mandates 7 hours of instructional time, not inclusive of break, meal periods, or anything else. To be in compliance with Public Law 34-105 while providing secondary students a meal period and necessary breaks between classes, we would have to extend the school day by at least 2 hours, or extend the school year by an equivalent amount of time. Remember, teachers' duty days require that they need time outside of the instructional time, which include, but is not limited to, preparing lesson plans or materials, correcting papers, conferring with students, parents, colleagues, administrating, or performing other professional activities. Should we do anything that affects the teacher's duty day to accommodate the extra school hours, it will be at an additional cost to the government of Guam. Or we can simply amend Public Law 34-105 for secondary schools. My review of the school bell schedule for secondary schools indicate at least 2 hours are needed for meals and breaks. Amending Public Law 34-105 to read 900 hours of instructional time for secondary schools will accomplish that. 180 days times 5 hours a day equals 900 hours of instructional time per year. I believe this will eliminate the discrepancies caused by converting the 180 instructional days to instructional time. And I thank you for this opportunity for letting me express my concerns, and I thank you for your time here on behalf of our students.
Thank you, Mr. Birch and Mrs. Benavente. I'd like to acknowledge my colleague, Senator Marsh Titano, for joining us. Thank you for being here. So I feel that maybe perhaps GFT should have come to the table as well, as we're discussing the collective bargaining agreements. So just looking at the instances of Public Law 34-105, looking back in the committee report, I noticed that there were about 34 teachers that stated for certain reasons why they did not support that bill at the time. And listening to Mr. Birch's concerns, I want to really help the public to understand the impact of the hours that you implemented for the school year 2019 to 2020, or was it just last year, 2018 to 2019? So the impact of those instructional hours, how did it impact the students? How did you make up for the hours, or perhaps not make up, but perhaps take away some instructional hours because it exceeded the time? It's a little bit muddy, right? So when you apply, because you have so many different schools applying different bell schedules, so it's kind of like on a case-by-case basis. But the way I see the law and its approach is it's recommending this instructional change for everything. And so perhaps we can just educate the public a little bit about the impacts of what happened in school year 2018 to 19 when you implemented Public Law 34-105.
John Fernandez, Superintendent of the Guam Department of Education. Let me also recognize Carlin Borja, one of our newest board members, recently confirmed and appointed, and then I'm joined also by Deputy Superintendent Joe Sanchez for Curriculum and Instruction. And behind us, we have, we're here for both the interscholastics as well as the instructional discussions, but we do have members on the GFT as well as on our side, on the management side, who participate in the joint calendar committee that addressed this issue and brought forth suggestions to change. So just wanted to recognize those who are in the room. With regard to the last year, I think the whole issue comes down to interpretation and intent of this law. So I think everyone's familiar with the 180-day requirement in our 14 points mandate. When we went to, when we dealt with the FESPAC during the 1 year, and we had to look at ways to meet the 180-day requirement, the legislature passed alternate language to define it as 180-day or its equivalent, and therefore you got into this discussion about how to define that equivalent. So that was not clearly addressed, but we recognized there was flexibility, and it was in response to that 1 year. But we actually, working with that and working with our teachers and administrators, were able to use the similar schedule to build in more professional development time. And so those are some of the impacts of just changing the language in the 180-day mandate. But going beyond that, I think the public law that was passed and sponsored by Senator San Augustine was really meant to then further define what it meant to describe the instructional time. I think that the challenge that we face is that the understanding about the intent was to find a way to address some of the makeup, the lack of clarity around how the instructional time would be made up if it were lost due to typhoons or other emergencies, right? So what ended up happening was an attempt to convert the instructional time, the instructional days into instructional hours. Part of the challenge is, and this is where like you said, it gets muddy, is sometimes when we're even in the context of the collective bargaining agreement, we're using instructional time and instructional days, in the same paragraph, in the same sentence, and sometimes you can get lost as to what exactly characterizes the day versus the time. Duty day, instructional time. And so the intent, that, as I understood it at the time, was to just basically break down the 180-day requirement into hours, so that when it came down to operationalizing makeup time, we could make up the days, and we could make up the lost time in hourly increments. And so our understanding was that with that intent and with the language here, which is an attempt to clarify it as being put before you, was to move forward into the year under the same circumstances as set forth in our CBA, just with the additional opportunity to make up hours instead of days and have more clarity around the makeup time. I know that several people, I know Mr. Mead, who's in the room, and others raised a question about exactly how this was interpreted, because if you read it as purely instructional time, and I'll let him speak for himself, but there was an implication that you would then need to add hours to the day or to the add days to the year to account for what it seemed to say in this law. And so again, operationally we didn't change, we didn't add that time. Our understanding of the intent was not to add more time to the instructional day for our teachers. That was, that shared understanding between the union and ourselves. And so, but again, we said this definitely needs to be clarified if it's going to exist in law, so that there isn't that confusion. Otherwise, there could be the implication of saying, well, if this is a shared interpretation, what does it mean for adding time, compensating teachers, affecting the collective bargaining agreement and what it says, in our negotiated agreement, and so forth. So, again, we didn't change anything operationally, because initially we just felt that that the law was giving us more flexibility in making up time, but there has been some questions raised about whether that's the proper interpretation.
And so are we addressing this resolution 2019-10 to clarify the difference between interpretation and intent?
Yes. So what we did is, based on those concerns, we brought the matter back to the Joint Calendar Committee, made up of management and GFT members, and had them work on it, and then present a draft resolution to the board for its consideration. And then, of course, because it involves legislative change, brought that forth to the legislature.
So in the resolution, the adjustments are made in Section 2, Section 715, I think L13 of Chapter 7, Title 1 of the Guam Code annotated is hereby amended to read 13, at least 180 instructional days or its equivalents, including makeup days each school year, with school years ending no later than 30 days following the end of the calendared year, the end of the calendared school year. A, the 180-day instructional days are to be converted at a minimum, so you include it at a minimum, into the equivalent, and you cross out hours by computing elementary school days at 5 hours, and therefore changing it to of 300 instructional minutes per day for a total of 54,000 minutes per 180 days. In accordance, item B, in accordance with 17 GCA subsection 3103G, the superintendent is authorized to develop a standard operating procedure to determine whether and when the loss of instruction may be waived in the event an emergency or natural disaster results in disruptions to instructional time. Scheduled Easter and Christmas breaks shall not be included in makeup days or hours. And so we're looking at this, and so we understand that Easter and Christmas breaks are not included, but perhaps other days that are dedicated to recognizing, like for example, Labor Day, Memorial Day, Our Lady of Cameron Day. Are we looking at all those other days, including summer days, as an option? Actually,
what we did was we built in 9 additional professional development days into the calendar, so they're already built-in days when teachers are to report. In the event that we need a makeup day, we've been able to use those preset days, and that's worked for the past year.
Okay. And then to hear on the impacts of the collective bargaining agreement, perhaps Sanjay, you can add some comments into this move, whether it impacts the collective bargaining agreement, or is this something that you have sought legal advice, and thank you. And it is in line with the collective bargaining agreement.
Sure. If I can go ahead and speak to what the board had proposed in its resolution.
Sorry, can you just state your name for the record?
It's Sanjay Sharma, president of GFT. Going back to Resolution 2019-10 proposed by the Education Board, what that does is it converts 180 days into instructional minutes. Now, if you look at the intent of Klitsky's original bill that became the Adequate Education Act, with its 14 points, on point number 13, it says that the school year should have a minimum of 180 days. Now, if that were to be further clarified, my guidance on that would be to convert it to, say, 900 calendared instructional hours. And what this does is it takes your 180 days and it converts it into hours instead of minutes, and continue the language as originally stated in there, including makeup days for each school year, with school year ending no later than 30 days following the end of the calendared school year. And for the makeup days, on point A of the law, I'd rather have it say that the superintendent shall determine the specific makeup days and makeup hours whenever feasible. I believe the intent is to keep or to have a yearly calendar that has 180 days. In this case, 900 instructional hours. And this is where the board and GFT are in agreement. 900 instructional hours, it's been like this for all the years I've been in as a teacher. 900 instructional hours per year. To change that language and then put in the length of a school day in place of instructional hours, that changed, I believe, the intent of having 180 school days. Now, the reason why we've switched with 180 school days into hours was at one point with the legislature, then Senator Rory Respicio proposed the idea that Christmas and Easter should not be used for makeup days. And that was the intent. But we've then used that bill when he said 180 days, he added on or its equivalent. And that's what caused this conundrum that we currently have. Saying that it's 180 days or its equivalent led to, well, what do we mean by its equivalent? Do we add hours to the day, and can we reduce the amount of days like we currently have from 180 days down to 170 days, 173 days of instruction as opposed to 180. And so it becomes this, what do we mean by 180 days? And so I think the best approach to this would be to say 900 calendared instructional hours. Because I think the intent is to have at least 180 days or its equivalents for the students to come to school. If there's any makeup days, we could always go back into the table, work through our contract if we have to, but I'd rather the superintendent determine how those hours are made. After all, the superintendent is in charge of the day-to-day operations of the school. So if the superintendent sees that some schools need to increase their hours for a missed day, that would be up to the superintendent, I feel. Or if makeup days need to be used throughout summer, let's say the last week of school, there's a typhoon that happens and we miss 3 days of school. If it's not feasible to make up the days, I think that judgment call should be based upon the superintendent. It's been fortunate that we haven't had any major storms since 2002. We haven't had a super typhoon come our way over the island. But I remember back in 2002, where we ended up having many months of missed school days. And if this bill were to stand as is now, we would be using all of June to make up school. Or we would also have to increase the amount of hours we have for school. So based upon the math I've done, we were looking at close to 12 and 13 hours worth of school per day if this law were to stand back in 2002. Thankfully, it didn't, and we didn't have to have schools run for 12 to 13 hours a day. So I think you have to go back to the intent, and I think the intent is to have 180 school days calendared. And in this case, 900 instructional hours would do that.
Thank you. So I'm interested in the implementation. Let's say, for example, let's use Tumuning Elementary. I believe it was last year where their AC was down, right? So in some instances, they had to have, in a sense, almost a half day or a shortened day. And did the students and the parents and the teachers have additional calendars added, additional calendar days added to that for that school year?
If I recall correctly, we actually had to work out the exact number of minutes to add to the schedule for Tumuning and Tumuning Elementary in particular. to meet the requirements. So it didn't go back to aligning the math. Basically, we had to figure out how much time was left to the rest of the end of the school year, and then based on those number of days, how many minutes per day could be added to be the equivalent.
So how many school days were added to meet the instructional time?
No school days were added, but minutes were added to each of the days.
Okay.
So they started earlier, and I believe they ended a little bit later.
Okay. And what was the,
So
were there any concerns with the stakeholders, or they were just like, okay, we'll go with the early start and later school day?
Right, so we had to work with the community and the principal to try to figure out the best way to address that. The issue at Tamuning was the air conditioning had gone down, and so the idea was to try to make sure that we were able to operate the school safely so that the parents felt comfortable. But at the end of the day, once we were able to make some of the repairs, we had to end up extending the days to make up for the time lost in the rest of the year. So we did, I'd have to go back to some of the details on that, but we did have to shut down the school for a little bit, and then when we went back, we had to lengthen the days.
Okay. And then in the last item that we're going to address is the superintendent is authorized to develop a standard operating procedure to determine whether and when the loss of instruction may be waived in the event of an emergency or natural disaster. And I'm also thinking, are you considering the incident at Tamuning Elementary where you had to adjust the instructional daytime?
Right.
And then results in disruptions of instructional time. So I'm just curious why we had to outline this specifically within the law. Are you not given that authority already?
I think that's really an effort to clarify, well, I guess the intent, which was the makeup, how to make up time. So typically these matters don't get raised to the legislative level. They're typically handled within the board and with the union directly. So when it was elevated to this level of trying to do the equivalents and figure out those pieces, I think the intent was to clarify exactly how the makeup process would work. I will be admittedly and coming into the department and just operating under current practices. There was, if you had a storm or some emergency and the kids made it, past lunch, then we were considering it a full day that didn't need to be made up. Of course, in the discussions that we've been having over the past, year, we've noted that isn't in writing. So I think the idea is not only to grant that flexibility, but to put it in an established procedure. And so I think it's, number one, clarifying when, how to make up time, when, and also when it might be appropriate to waive the makeup time. So we learned in other jurisdictions that sometimes those jurisdictions going through fires, right? We've seen those fire disasters, or we've seen like really bad storms, that at some point when it's just so many lost days, it ends up being the board or the superintendent who then have the authority to waive those days. And I think that needed to be clarified in the law, but since there is a 180-day requirement.
Okay, thank you. Has this been properly vetted through the various stakeholders, like our parents, our faculty, staff, and the students that we're looking to make this change from hours to minutes for the secondary schools?
So, we didn't have any specific community meetings on this matter, but we did go through the work sessions, which are open work sessions, as well as to the board meetings, which are again open and public board meetings. And I believe when the senator introduced this bill originally, there were also public hearings associated with that. I think the issue really hasn't been raised by the stakeholders. It's really been raised by those of us, by those who are more familiar with the instructional time and instructional day discussion. So it was kind of at a different level of discussion where people noticed the discrepancy. So union members, management said, hey, wait a minute, this instructional time and instructional day, which probably doesn't get discussed in the general public, for our purposes, we want to make sure we clarify it because it impacts the collective bargaining agreement and other things that we do in terms of calculating makeup time and so forth. So we didn't really do an outreach to students and so forth. I think that what would be important is I think you're getting at is the superintendent's authority and procedures to make up time. that would be of interest to our stakeholders, especially students who might seek clarity as to what happens when there's a storm and they don't want to come back and make up the time, or So
I believe the public is already aware that you have the authority to do that. They're looking to you to do that.
to clarify, well, I think the authority's there,
looking
but
to you to determine the makeup
right.
time, right?
Right,
So
right.
I'm
So-
just making sure that, because there was some concern, you're changing the language from days to hours, and now we're going even deeper into changing it to minutes.
correct.
And so I'm just making sure that, the public is aware for the resolutions that the board also pushes as well. I mean, we had an incident with Chief Brody where there was a lot of misinformation being given. Even the
Right.
administrators were unaware that this change was happening until it came out in the news. And there was further misinformation given about my stance on Chief Brody by some board members. And so I just want to make sure that we're having a roundtable or this kind of discussion before we move forward, so that we're all on the same page.
Right.
And so I just want to make sure that that's clear, that when, the board also pushes resolutions, I mean, I'm sure the parents don't really pay attention. They trust those who are appointed and elected into these positions to make the decisions for the best of the children and the community. So, no, it doesn't need to be explained. And then, and I just want to, I'm not challenging the resolution itself. I'm making sure that we are having this briefing to ensure that the public is aware before we produce a bill and then changes were made. Okay.
Yeah, Senator, I just want to thank you also because it was through your recommendation that we go back out into the community, and we did hold public hearings regarding the Chief Brody conversion. And so we afforded the opportunity at your request to go out and do another round. So we had folks that did come out. We heard the comments, and I think it was a good exercise for us to continue. And we've been doing that. We've been going out to the community, and we understand, that some of these things are very complex. In terms of the hours and all the things that we're not forced to, but asked to consider. And so I look at it this way: if it's weak in certain areas, how can we improve it? And how can we make it better? At the end of the day, it's for our students. So I just want to let you know that I attended those meetings, and I was, pleased that there are people that actually participated that were affected by it. So we'll continue to do that. We'll continue to reach out to the stakeholders, and where there's gaps in our policies, we got to close those gaps so that, and it has to be very clear. And I agree with you that it has to be clear. Thank you.
Is there anyone from the public that would like to come and speak? Mr. Mead, you look like you're standing back there. Okay, we'll allow you 5 minutes to speak on some of the concerns. Because you were previously a board member, we are affording you this opportunity during this time. This is not a public hearing, so usually we only address the agencies involved and the organizations. But because you are a previous board member, we'll allow you 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to give you a background, I'm a former member of the Guam Education Board. Okay now? I'm a former member of the Guam Education Board. I'm a former treasurer for the Guam Federation of Teachers. I'm the former president of the Guam Community College Faculty Union. And I'm currently employed by the Guam Community College Faculty Union as their union representative under PEMRA. And that's what began or caused me to research at the beginning of this beginning of the school year as a GCC Faculty Union rep out of concern of what will happen come May 28th when someone realizes they have a lot of makeup hours should GDOE not react to Public Law 34-105, which was dated June 6, 2018. And the GCC faculty have fulfilled their classroom requirement under the GCC BOT agreement, which stipulates following the GDOE calendar ending May 28, because. So in line with that, I sent a FOIA request to the GDO superintendent and the Guam Education Board chair electronically. I attached that to you. And the response I got was that since GDOE doesn't have the information, they aren't required to respond. The question to that is this, and it's not in my testimony, but it's a question I have. It would seem that GDOE would want this information readily at hand so that they could adequately schedule makeup days and hours, so that if a parent ever asked why, they would have an answer. It would seem that every principal of every school would have the record. This last year, they did their makeup. I don't know how many days they accomplished or what they accomplished by adding 4 minutes to a classroom, to a class time. Excuse me, 4 minutes? I was a teacher as well as everything else. I know what 4 minutes can do. Anyway, and through further discussion, I received this email from Mr. Fernandez saying, "My apologies for a delayed response, Mr. Meade. Your initial request has been handled by the legal team." I never heard from them. And the response stands as far as my FOIA. My separate email to you was not a matter of responding to the FOIA, which has to do with public records, but a review of the underlying issue. I did request Deputy Superintendent Joe Sanchez to review as he was tracking this legislation during its consideration by the legislature. Based on Deputy Superintendent Sanchez's review, it appears that you are not counting lunch, which is included in the secondary school's calculations. Deputy Superintendent Sanchez did not ask about this calculation when he met with GFT President Sanjay Sharma. So it looks to me as though, and because I had to ask myself a question, Sanjay Sharma is a smart guy. Sanjay Sharma signed off on the GFT-GEB agreement. And in that agreement, there's a definition of instructional time, and it's not lunch. And the 7 hours is to the total length of time that faculty are required to be at the work site. They do not provide instructional time during lunch. Consequently, I'm going, why would he say that? Well, Mr. Sharma worked with the senator on the calculations. The calculations do not affect the length of the school day, which is true. 7 hours didn't increase the school day, but those 7 hours are reflected as, quote unquote, in the law, instructional time, which it can't be. The calculations do not affect the length of school day or our professional development days with regard to Southern High, which is a different story. The change in the law should not affect them any differently than the schools. Please let me know if you have further questions. We did not draft the legislation, but we have been working to follow it based on our understanding of the legislation, its intent. And that's true. In the legislation itself, there is a stack of letters. It's a form letter, all opposing the bill. Because many people realized that 1260 was ludicrous, wasn't going to happen, couldn't be done, and violated the union contract, which means, as I alluded to later, technically this law can't come into effect until 1 November 2022. That's true. And then I suggested some changes might be made. But the whole thing is that, to me, and I'm questioning and I wonder, where was the Guam Education Board since Board Policy 346 speaks specifically to this subject, but hasn't been updated since 1984. And as when I was on the Board of Education, I kept reminding them that more than 60% of all board policies are older than 1984 and haven't been reviewed, revised, or touched. And it would seem that in this case, that policy would have been brought and presented to the legislature for implementation or for review into the construction of the law. And it's more than evident that it wasn't. And it's more than evident based on the response from the superintendent, who may want to tell me otherwise later on today, that the GEB, and we can ask some of the members, if they even participated in the public session, because I don't see their names on the sign-in sheet. I see a lot of people that oppose this on the sign-in sheet. And when I spoke to Senator St. Augustine on this issue, he was pretty much appalled to the fact that lunch was being included because that wasn't his understanding. Well, Senator St. Augustine was on the Board of Education previously, and he knows my comments about the renewal and updating of board policy, which would have alleviated this whole mess had they done their job. Because also in the law that created the Education Board, it says that the Education Board shall, time to time, as they see fit, suggest to the legislation legislative changes like to the 14 points. But do we has the legislature ever received one? To my knowledge, never. This was the prime, perfect opportunity to fix this overall problem. And what I hear today, I'm sorry to say it this way, but from what I hear today is a more touchy-feely goody. We had a meeting on this issue. Everybody go back and have a nice day. And is it going to fix it? Are we really going to fix the instructional time days to facilitate the needs of who we're all supposedly here for, which is our children and students? Is that what we're really here going to do today? Is this outcome of this going to be a letter from you to them saying, did you fix it yet? And demand it be fixed? It's the responsibility of the Education Board to ensure that the superintendent does his job. This is not, quote unquote, operational. This is board policy, of which the operation of the department is run based on those policies. So, in leaving, I'm going to say again, as I have said always, I have standing in this issue. I have 2 granddaughters now in school. And if I don't affix my signature, I'll affix my son's. And I'm watching. And every single time someone told me run for the legislature, I said, no, it's more fun being a watchdog. Because trying to convince 14 other people to get on the wagon, it's difficult. So thank you, Madam Senator.
Mr. Meade, do you have a recommendation? Do you have a recommendation towards this resolution?
Well, if you want to bring, if you want to bring the law in line with what DOE is doing, what's been the norm? 5 hours of instructional time or 5.5? Whatever the norm has been, which is what's, 900 has always been from ever since for elementary school and the secondary, then just amend the law and amend the 1,260 to whatever it is. What have they been doing? I don't know why someone wanted to try and fix what one part of the department wasn't broken. And that should have been the argument to me.
I think they're trying to fix it now.
Simple solution to this, Senator, is put a bill out to amend that section of the law and revert it back to what it was. Then what you have is you do not have a conflict. You don't have to worry about what's going to happen in November of 2022 when you try and renegotiate the contract between the board and the union. It puts everybody in line. But I would also, in that law, stipulate that the Guam Education Board update not only Board Policy 346, but if I'm not mistaken, it's 345 and 345-1, which deal with high school and middle school, and work with the I call it faculty union, work with the GFT and those folks and the teachers that have been doing this for, yourself included, for how many years, and fix it. Okay. And if you'd like my recommendation, I have recommendations that I had submitted before for 345, 45-1, and 46. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Meade, for taking the time. All right. One thing I do want to ask is the impacts to the funding piece if we are to change it from hours to minutes now. Are you going to hire additional personnel to account for this time, or you're just going to do it within the current budget you operate on?
Yes, so within the current budget, and it would simply, again, align the law to, to what the intent was originally, when that wasn't going to include any budgetary impacts.
And is GFT letting the teachers become aware of this change in the secondary level?
What we've always had a position on was to offer 900 instructional hours, to go and count the minutes for every school of when they have their lunch, when they don't. I think it makes sense to go back to 5 instructional hours per day for 180 days, which would be 900 instructional hours. Going back to, instead of saying 180 days, I think it would be more feasible for the department to have 900 instructional hours in case our school district wants to do what other school districts are now doing in the face of their budget shortfalls, which is to go to their school of 4 days a week as opposed to 5 days a week. And so having 900 instructional hours allows the education board and the superintendent, as well as the legislature, based on funding, on how to balance the school year.
Okay.
900 instructional hours meets both demands.
Mr. Superintendent, do you?
So yes, we did originally. The language came from the work that had been done at the committee level, but upon review of the GFT's simplification, I mean it's basically the equivalent of the minutes into hours. We're okay with that.
So instead of it reading X amount of minutes, we will put 900 instructional hours. Is the board okay with this recommendation? Can you? Thank you.
So, sorry, the question again, one more time. Sorry.
Or maybe, so the superintendent agrees that perhaps 900 instructional hours is
Right.
the implemented
Right.
way to go as far as the GFT collective bargaining agreement.
Yes.
And so here it states 54,000 minutes per day, per 180 days. So we're going to now change it from 54,000 minutes to 900
Hours.
instructional
Yeah,
hours.
that is correct.
Are we okay with that, or perhaps you need to go back and?
We can revise the resolution
Okay.
to reflect that. But yes, it's a mutual agreement between
Okay.
management and the GFT.
Okay. All right. Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Thank you. Well, I think this has been a very productive informational briefing. I think this is one of the more compromised areas that we've been on. And so I'd like for us to, perhaps I think Senator Kelly Marsh-Teichno has a quick question or two and some statements, and then, okay.
Hafaday, it's good to see everybody here. It is important for us to all get together and figure out what is the best way forward, because I think everybody here wants to resolve this, and so that's important. And so it's a lot to absorb, I will say that. It's a lot to come into and absorb, because there's a lot of history here. There's a lot of there's a lot of variance, as you've pointed out, between the school systems. I mean, we're trying to come up with a standard, but then we're trying to apply it at these very different levels that have different situations in place. So one of the things that comes to mind, or there are a few things that come to mind. One, this may not help where we are right now, but moving forward, to revisit that definition of instructional hours. And I think, as I was thinking these things through, it seemed that there could be a couple of instructional hours. I mean, there's one, in a sense, as it applies to the instructors themselves, and then there's one that could apply to the school. And maybe they can meet, but it seems that definition that's being used for this instructional time or these instructional hours, that has been pointed out, there are discrepancies, and then how do we make sure that we're then in compliance? And so one of the fixes might be actually adjusting that definition, or having two that might be applied in two different ways. There could be flexibility. I don't know if this is a way to go, but I like to throw things out there, and then people can figure out if it absolutely does not apply, or if it maybe has some possibility. But there could perhaps be some language where it could be 180 days or the 900/1260 hours, although there are problems with that instructional hours because it does not match up with the day, and or minutes, whichever is the most applicable in a situation. So, you know, this is very rough. I'm throwing it out there. I'm not saying it's some absolute answer, but there may be a way to write that flexibility into the language that 180 days is probably the cleanest and most straightforward, but we understand our conditions. We live in a typhoon alley. We have unexpected water outages, power outages, and other things that we're contending with. And so then at times, switching over to the hours or minutes might be most appropriate. So there may be some flexibility in there that allows the department to maneuver within the intent of being compliant, the intent of providing our students the educational time and all of the time that goes on along with educational time that's required. And I did think it was a really good in the resolution where it outlines coming up with the standard operating procedure. I think that will really be a path forward when these situations arise. So I think that's a very good thing for us to be worked on and developed. So I just wanted to be able to throw those out there. Sujus Masi, Madam Chair, for allowing me to do that.
Could I, just a quick response?
Mr. Superintendent.
And in addition to that, Senator, I just want to say that there was a time before when the Guam Education Board, or DOE, and the Guam Federation of Teachers may not have been on the same page or not seen eye to eye. We went several years without a negotiated contract. But I'm glad to say that, 2017, we were able to get back to the table, negotiate a collective bargaining agreement, and in that collective bargaining agreement, also put in place mechanisms through joint committees to address matters like this and to bring it to the board's attention, to bring it to the legislature's attention. And I do want to say, and I just kudos to the team, especially our President Sanjay Sharma and I know past President Tim Fidenko for working. I think we've been working hand in hand to try to make sure that we're working together on behalf of our students and our teachers, and all of our staff. So I think that relationship, I hope, will continue to generate good ideas and positive movement forward and assist the legislature in its work as well.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. And I just want to note, I'm looking at the bell schedules that was provided by one of the members, and many of the school instruction hours for the year exceeds 900 hours, and so I'm thinking that this does not include the break and lunch period. Is that correct?
Yeah,
I'm looking at the bell schedule for your schools, for the schools in DOE, and many of the schools exceed the 900 instructional hours. So I just want to ensure that this does not include the break or recess and lunch periods.
I'm not familiar with that particular document that was shared, but yeah, instruction hours would generally not include lunch and whatnot.
Okay.
But
right.
may I just make a comment just to
Sure.
kind of clarify the response we provided to Mr. Mead, because it's kind of related to that.
Sure.
So the assertion that was made in the email that I provided to the superintendent and then I guess subsequently was shared with Mr. Mead was not the assertion that lunch should be included as instructional time. That's clearly not the intent. What it meant was meant to clarify was the math is actually pretty simple when you talk about where did you get the 1260. And the 54,000 minutes is equivalent to the 900 hours. So whether or not we use hours or minutes, for me personally, I really don't. It means the same thing. It comes out to the same amount. What happened with the law is, in the case of the current law, the 900 hours is recognized as both instructional time and instructional day for elementary school because it's the same thing. It doesn't include lunch. But what happened apparently was it inadvertently included lunch for secondary, and which is 1,080, and then it added another set, which made it 1260. So you can kind of tell where the mathematical error was, where in secondary schools they added lunch and they added passing time as part of the instructional day. That's why it comes out very clean when we say we would basically have to add 2 more hours to the day. So just by how the calculation's done, you can kind of tell where the confusion came in, where in one level it didn't include those, and in the secondary level it didn't. And at the time when the bill was being discussed, we really weren't pushing either. It was just a statement that if you're going to include lunch in one, then you have to include it in both, and you just have to clarify that that's how you define it. The good thing is that how it's defined in the CBA is pretty clear. Instructional time is the amount of time the teacher spends with the student. Instructional day is from the beginning to the end of the day. So based on the intent of the law, it's really instructional time and the student actually receiving instruction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Superintendent Sanchez. Is there anyone else that would like to speak in regards to instructional time? No? Okay. Yes, sir.
Oh, sorry.
Mr. Paris, please.
Franklin Paris.
Okay.
I was a member of the board representing GFT. I'm a teacher at JFK High School. And the reason why I decided to come and speak is because teachers don't get to come to these meetings. Teachers don't often come to these meetings because we are home doing the stuff we need to do. But just to give you a perspective, historical, I was a child, 1965, when Typhoon Karen hit. We were out of school for 6 months. Now, how in the world was I able to graduate on time in 1968? Missing 6 months out of the year because of a typhoon. I support the GFT's position on this 100%. We don't want to play games with hours and minutes and days, okay? And I applaud the administration for finding the need to make sure that this is clarified so that everybody understands what we speak about, okay? So that's why I'm speaking, that I am in support of the GFT's position in this matter, and I hope that you guys do the due diligence to not disappoint the teachers, because a reality check, in order to be successful on that first day, 13th of this month, I had to come in a week before to sign out the equipment, to prepare my classroom, to get everything ready so that first day is successful. Now, you didn't pay me for that. I wasn't paid. Okay? In the high school, there are a lot of teachers who are passionate that will tutor during lunch. They are not obligated to, but because of passion. And this has been the problem throughout, that teachers' passions have been taken advantage of. And now, a younger breed of teachers coming up, this is not going to happen that way. Okay? So, I'm a lowly high school teacher in the trenches, and I wish that more teachers would make these meetings. But that's why I decided to come and speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Paris, for your input. I believe there was an agreement that we are transitioning to the 900 hours. And I'd like to congratulate you on the work that you have done during the summer on finding teachers for our classrooms. I'd like to acknowledge everyone that worked towards that effort. So thank you very much. You did an exceptional job. I believe you have just a couple, like 20 some more that you need to fill, but great job on that effort. Great work. I'd like to transition now to the second item on the agenda, which is the interscholastic sports. I believe there was a news article in May, just to generalize it, GDOE is looking to take over interscholastic sports.
Right.
And perhaps we can see where we are with the impacts of GDOE taking over interscholastic sports. And also there are some concerns, the impact to the IIAG agreements, I guess, that we've been having throughout the years. God bless you. And I'd like to call any members of IIAG or concerned stakeholders within our public, if they'd like to make any comment. And please, if perhaps, Mr. Chair or Mr. Superintendent, that you can give us just, you know, a brief back on what has transpired and the actions that we are taking to move forward from it and see what we can do to kind of mediate some of the issues and concerns that there are in the general public. Thank you.
9%? Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Senator. On behalf of our chairperson of the Safe and Healthy Committee of the Board, I'd just like to read this testimony. On May 21st, the Guam Education Board voted unanimously to approve a motion by GEB member Mr. James Lujan to have the Guam Department of Education directly handle interscholastic high school sports for its schools no later than January 1st, 2020, and for at least 2 years thereafter. The decision came after several work sessions held by the board with high school principals, athletic directors, private schools, and other community stakeholders. As a result, the superintendent, John Fernandez, was given the authority and support to begin the transition of GDOE high school interscholastic sports back under the management of the department. In general, the GEB believed that there were several opportunities for GDOE to improve interscholastic sports for its schools and students under the leadership of the superintendent and outside the membership structure of the Independent Interscholastic Athletic Association of Guam. The GEB felt that it was more strategic planning and development of the interscholastic sports program was in order to ensure a focus on outcomes for student athletes, a more systematic approach to facilitating those outcomes, and overall support for athletes, coaches, and officials. At this stage, Superintendent Fernandez is working internally with his principals and athletic directors to map out the transition from IIAAG to GDOE with the focus on keeping the status quo over the first 2 quarters of the year, managing a seamless transition for third quarter sports, and minimizing disruption for athletes and their families. In addition, GDOE is committed to ensuring that public, including IIAAG partners, are regularly informed about the transition plan progress over this time period. We look forward to their updates over the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you. So can you just please explain what was some of the challenges that you were having that, you know, allowed you to come to this decision to move forward with taking over the interscholastic sports? I'd also like to address the contractual budget that will be impacted by it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
There was some discussion that came to the board regarding, you know, sports, the sports program within the Department of Education, and since it was a safe and healthy issue, it was addressed at that level. We asked the superintendent to kind of look into the program and what's going on with you know, the organization that's handling the sports program.
And that's the IIAG?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So there was a safe and health issue concern.
Yes, there were some issues that were brought to our attention, particularly the chair of the committee, and he mentioned in one of our board meetings that he wanted to go a little bit further and look at what's going on with the sports program, and then he felt there were some areas that needed to be looked at. And so that was the impetus for the discussion to lead into whether or not the Department of Education would be able to manage the sports program. And so that was raised at a board meeting, and then I put it back to committee and I said, okay, we're going to put it back to his committee, and they held stakeholder meetings. They called in the athletic directors and the principals, and of course there was some concern that was raised to our, at that committee, and then we further allowed more discussion to occur, and when we needed to start looking at towards the end of the school year, we said, okay, what is the board going to do to assist the superintendent in some of the areas that were concerned? And so the board asked the superintendent to look into this and to present to us a plan, a transition plan to basically oversee the sports program. And so that's what led to this point. So the superintendent has the meat and potatoes, if you will, of how this thing's going to roll out, so I can...
So I just want to, just so the people know, right, the public, who is the chair of the Interscholastic Sports Committee and the board?
Mr. James Lujan, who's the chair of the Safety and Health Committee.
Safety and Health, and so that falls under
yes, that's
Interscholastics.
Yes.
Okay. And then the, what were some of the health and safety concerns that were brought up?
You want to...
Let me, if I could. So, I think we start back with the board's role in setting policy for how we conduct our interscholastic sports. So right now we're currently a member of the IIAAG, which essentially is a membership organization where our schools are allowed to participate and vote on matters pertaining to interscholastic sports. Under the bylaws of IIAAG, it's the principals who participate or the athletic directors. In practice, it's really been our athletic directors representing their schools who've been a part of this organization. Mr. Lujan, has been the leader on the board in terms of looking at interscholastic sports and some of the issues that come up in the paper regarding how disputes are handled, how decisions are made, issues related to use of facilities, issues related to how disputes are resolved between schools, whether regarding athletes or regarding schedules. So they're actually, every time we see a news story, the question comes back is, are we satisfied with how interscholastic is working? So Deputy Superintendent Joe Sanchez, I asked him to take the lead in having that input session and the continued discussion with the stakeholders, our internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, and just so if I can introduce at the table as well, Mr. Algarito, who will be handling some of the transition work at the staff level, working with our high school principals and our athletic directors as well. So even though it falls within the Safe and Healthy Schools Committee, a lot of the issues range from in terms of access, equity, and how schools felt they were treated. But I think what if I could speak on behalf of Mr. Lujan, who is unable to be here today, he's off island. If I could, I think the turning point in the discussion had to do with how the IIAAG organization could handle and address some of the concerns that were coming up with regard to policy, with regard to strategic direction of sports and so forth. And it's not really a knock on the IIAAG, but if you look at how it's comprised of our individual schools representing their schools. And I think the question posed to me was, what is the GDOE strategy for all of our students, not just JFK or Simon Sanchez? And when they come to these meetings, are we thinking strategically about our kids and what we want to see for these public school students and so forth? So I think ultimately, it came down to one of the work sessions in which Mr. Lujan and myself in engaging with our members on the IIAAG, one of whom was the chair, raised the question as to, after several months of raising these issues publicly in the board meetings, it was in the media as to this potential shift because of these concerns, what was the IIAAG doing to address those concerns, and had they taken them under consideration? Was there a plan to address them? And the answer was basically no. And again, I don't say this to knock the organization. I say that, fundamentally, if you look at them, they're really running the day-to-day operations of the sports season, the scheduling, the games, handling the information outside the games, and dealing with disputes and so forth. I felt that, in our conversation with the board, the question was, okay, so how are we thinking about the big picture questions, right? What are these, these questions that have been raised about how are students able to fully participate? And what is the issue about the grade policies, the attendance policies? What are the college and career outcomes for our students? And trying to get us to think more as a department about these issues. And admittedly, when we defer to our athletic directors, we really are telling them to represent your school, but no one's really thinking about the overall picture. So I think the board's resolution really was, take 2 years. The motion basically said, take the sports program for the public high school sports back under the DOE management. And for the next 2 years, we want you to be able to answer these questions for us in terms of DOE's strategy around interscholastic sports. So the motion itself says, for the next 2 years, run this internally. And I guess the assumption is after those 2 years, we can decide, whether that structure should continue or, somehow evolve, to something else.
So, thank you, Mr. Superintendent. But the question is what were and this is very big for me, right? Because it involves the students. what were the safety and health concerns that were not being addressed? And you said something about equity. Okay, just a moment. Senator Shelton has something to say.
I'm just wondering about those safety and health concerns too, and then everything that you just mentioned, I'm wondering if that's what Mr. Lujan was talking about when he was quoted as saying the problem was that there was no hierarchy and those who made the decisions had conflicting interests. So what are these conflicting interests and how did they play out as a problem for DOE?
If I could clarify, and then let me ask my deputy since he's been the point person. I think what Mr. Mendiola was referring to was Mr. Lujan is in charge of the Safe and Healthy Schools Committee, but the actual issues are the ones that I discussed, which are not necessarily safety and health issues, but more about the operations and the other types of equity issues, how disputes are settled that were raised to us from our high school principals and athletic directors. So just to clarify that. And
so it is not a health and safety issue? It is the operational issue.
Yeah, it was both. In my opinion, we also had some discussion, regarding, our safety equipment, equipment that our kids are using.
Your safety equipment?
Yeah.
The school safety equipment?
Well, athletic equipment.
Okay.
Our facilities,
Do the parents purchase, like, for example, let's say football, do the parents purchase the football gear or does the school provide it to them?
I believe there's certain equipment that's provided to them, but then the parents do also purchase some supplemental.
So what role does IIAG play for safety of the equipment and gear?
That's, for me, I can't answer for that for IIAG, but for me, when I first came on the board, it was, some of the equipment that our children are using are actually old and need to be replaced. And so those are certain things that, was raised to my attention, and that's one of the discussion I know that Mr. Lujan wanted to ensure. In addition to that, our facilities, we just had some lights put back up at the GW field after a major storm. So there was, it overlapped. Some of these issues overlap, but as it pertains to the operational issues of IIAG, it got deeper into that realm. So initially when it went to Safe and Healthy, it kind of evolved into that area, and then it kind of looking, what are we, how is that partnership formulated to help also the Department of Education with its own programs.
Does IIAG provide equipment to the players? Just go ahead and just state your name real quick for the record. And
Terry DeBold from the IIAG. I'm the new president, effective June, and quite frankly, I'm kind of confused as to the direction that Mr. Mendiola is going, because
there's
safety equipment, I'm hearing there was an issue concerning safety equipment that the students are using, but that would be an internal school matter, not a IIAG matter, as they mentioned, as the director mentioned.
Are you supposed to check equipment or perform any kind of tests?
The officials do check equipment to ensure that the equipment is appropriate. I mean, if there had been a specific concern at any time whatsoever, I am sure that somebody like an official would say, this equipment is inappropriate or it's not safe, therefore it needs to be changed. We would receive that information.
But you don't provide equipment.
We've never received anything from GDOE that would ever that I can recall concerning any safety hazards. As far as the lights on the field, that would be a facilities issue. I believe that, for example, they just mentioned GW Field. The former president who'd been there, and I applaud him for over 10 years as a president of IIAG, is actually the athletic director of GW Field. I'm sure that he'd requested for the funding for the lights to be corrected. I'm not sure if perhaps that was more of a funding issue rather than IIAG being responsible for ensuring that the lights were changed. I'm not able to associate.
Can I clarify?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so basically, I'm trying to give the background of how this came to the board, and the appropriate committee to respond to that was a Safe and Healthy committee, because Mr. Lujan was the one that raised the issue. So I forwarded it to his committee to basically do the work session so that he can get information to see whether or not this was a real issue for the board to address, or if it was just an isolated incident. And further, it led into his comment in the, as you quoted, the hierarchy of the organization. Yes, and so then he started going into it in a meeting with our folks, And so this issue didn't it had its own, it grew from what initially came to the board, right? And so I was talking about the safety of the helmets. That was a conversation I recall when I first came on the board with previous board members, is what are we doing for the equipment? What are we doing for all these different things? And then it fell onto my lap because it's a budget issue. And so, see, that's how it all kind of came together. So hopefully, but
it's really, that does not involve IIAG. The issue is not the safety and health. The issue is the hierarchy of the organization and the equity concern. So what is the equity concern?
You can respond to
So I'll go ahead and start off, and then I can, if I need more detail. But basically, I think the issues that are raised to us by some of our members in the IIAG were just, some of them were just issues related to how decisions were made, and pretty much the leverage that private schools seem to have versus the public schools, and whether there were enough of the rules in place to ensure fair and equitable treatment. So I think a lot of different schools brought up different incidents and issues where decisions may have been made by the IIAG, and that was some of the complaint. So I think the issue was, how are these disputes managed and so forth. So without going and fully investigating these matters, I mean, it's not that wasn't the issue. The issue was, it seemed to be there was a discomfort about how matters are being addressed in this membership organization versus what happens typically with GDOE. You have processes in place, SOPs in place, policies in place, full transparency, open meetings to address issues of concern. I mean, it's just because we're required to do so in so many different ways. With IIAG, as the superintendent, I felt like we had kind of outsourced those responsibilities. So when the question comes back to me, I don't have an answer. I can't say whether something is done equitably or not equitably, or if it was handled appropriately. I've been comfortable saying, okay, IIAG is taking care of it. So I think the issue was when the board came and said, look, are we satisfied with how we're running, how these things are being handled? When we reached out to our internal stakeholders, are you guys satisfied? There was very early in the discussion, there was a consensus among our high schools to see if it was possible to separate and to address these matters. And I think that's what the board heard. And even at the very late stages of the discussion, we were considering, what are the options to just continue within the current structure, or to take it on independently. And the board's decision was to take it independently, take it on internally. And so with that directive, we're moving forward to transition accordingly.
So you're saying that, can you give perhaps maybe a concrete example of some of the equity issues that were put forth and the stakeholders or the members were not in agreement of? And is there what really was the straw that broke the camel's back?
And I don't want to put these athletic directors on the spot either.
Because
but
I can argue
what I would
with
say
refs
is,
all day, and I don't like their calls
yes,
either.
well, that's the thing
I even got banned
too.
from a league for a half a year because I argued with the refs. So I'm just saying.
Right, and I haven't gone to that level either. I mean, I do think things that we had heard were matters involving votes involving members of the IIAG, where a voting member would not necessarily be participating in that exact in that sport, but somehow being able to affect the outcome of one of the participants. Examples like that. I mean, there was a dispute, and again, I'm going to let you know what we heard, right. Not to say that whether or not it was actually found to be valid or not. There were disputes relative to a decision made about a wrestling championship venue, participation of the wrestling team, or being able to affiliate with another school. So this was Simon Sanchez early on in the year. All I can say is that when I get asked that question, I say I don't really know. We don't get involved. It's the schools and the school athletic directors. They're deciding. I just think that when we brought it to the table, there was enough of support by the principals and athletic directors to just regroup and take a look at it internally. So for me, again, without going back incident by incident and judging what took place, and because that typically isn't within our purview, I think the directive of the board was maybe we should have a better grasp as to how these things are being handled. and so that there isn't any question, especially by our internal stakeholders, about as to how our student athletes are faring and how they, and how the program should be developing and what protections should be in place. So again, I can't really comment on IIAAG's practices. It's been a benefit to us really to be able to not have to deal with IIAAG, which I see mostly as, complaints about student participation, being able to, someone being suspended from a game or, expelled from a game or questioning referee decisions and things like that. I've, typically say, okay, that's not really in our, my purview. I'm glad someone else is handling it. But, I think after hearing the internal stakeholder input, the board said, look, let's take it in for at least 2 years and try to work on being very clear about, how these matters are to be handled. And within when it's reference to the hierarchy, I think the issue was, it's more of a membership organization. I know there are officers over IIAAG, but that's kind of different from the DOE organization where there's a clear line of authority. So all schools are going to follow the directives and policies that are determined and, by the board or superintendent. So it's just a different expectation, I think, by the board member that there should be a more clear set of hierarchy and decision-making procedures.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Superintendent, for clarifying. And then, how is this going to impact the competitions between the public schools and private schools? Because we know that in some areas there's some rivalry between perhaps GW and FD. So
yes.
Are we going to miss out on the football season after this year?
Right. So our intent, so this year, as we look at a transition year, we look at it as a transition in governance. So it is not our intent. First of all, we did reach out to IIAAG and say, look, status quo for the first and second quarters. We intend to participate. So our schools want to fully engage in the first and second quarter sports. And then we will work with you to to inform you as to our process and decisions going into third and fourth quarters when we will make that transition. So first 2 quarters, especially football season coming up, yes, there will definitely be public and private school competition.
But what about the following year after that?
Right. So come third and fourth quarter, and then the following year, third and fourth quarter, we also don't want to be disruptive. So we're not trying to make, in addition to governance change, also start putting in new rules and new. We're just what we'd like to do is do the transition and the governance, review the bylaws, look at procedures, but really any other more significant change than that would probably happen in the summer for the coming school year. So for this third and fourth quarter, you'll see a change in the operation and who's in charge and who's running things, but any further change we would hold off until the coming school year. Whether or not I don't want to say whether or not, I want to say, how we compete with private schools is still to be determined. And like I said, we have an internal committee aimed at trying to address the options there, and then we would want to work with our IIAAG counterparts to see what made sense to them as well. I think there was a desire to see that the competitions continue, how it happens and in what format. I think for us, we can look at other jurisdictions to see how that's being handled, but it's our intent to lay those options out and work with IIAAG to see what would work, because we would definitely need also their input.
Okay. And I noticed in the budget request for this fiscal year, for the interscholastic sports, it is $1.298 million, roughly 1.299.
Yes.
And so,
that's in the request.
Tell me a little bit about that. Yeah.
It's in the request.
But it says contractual, and so since we're going away from the contractual impacts, I want to.
Right. So we would still need to hire coaches and contract out for officiating and so forth. So there's still going to be a need for that. I will tell you just off the bat, but we don't need to make that decision right away. I do know that it's been a desire, and I would think shared by IIAAG, that at some point, hopefully through Healthy Future Fund funding, that we would be able to finally address some of the coaches' compensation down the road. We know that coaching stipends haven't changed for maybe a couple decades, and so part of our discussion is obviously maintaining the contractual relationships that we have to ensure that games are properly officiated and that we can pay coaches. But when we look for an increase, so I think one of those things that we do want to tackle is going to be At some point when there are resources available, looking at coaching stipends for those who are volunteering their time. When we want to do that in conjunction with more professional development for our coaches and officials as well. So hand in hand, trying to improve the quality of coaching and officiating, but also recognize that what we hear from our coaches, they're really doing it out of their love for the sport and for seeing the kids develop and compete. But they come to us and say, we haven't seen any change for 2 decades, but we still want to see support our kids and see them compete. So so when we request additional funding, some of those items are.
Did you receive that amount for FY 2019? On this schedule here, I don't have the dollar amount.
I don't have the exact numbers, but I know it's been mostly status quo.
The status quo?
It's less. Less than this, but yeah.
Okay. And then I'm looking at the. I'm looking that you accounted for officiating and membership fees to $290,550.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking that this accounting here is specifically because you were working under membership fees with the IIAG. So this number, it would be 2 quarters less.
It would just revert to the cost it would be to have officials officiating.
So who would you rely on to officiate if you no longer are in partnership with IIAG?
We'd have to put that out on bid. Yeah, we put that out to bid.
Who else provides that kind of service on Guam other than IIAG?
Well, it's usually through the officiating associations.
Yeah, so the IIAG was the organization that we entered to participate in their league, and they were the ones who actually contracted the officials.
Okay.
So part of the fee that we would pay in would be to cover the cost of the officials.
So
when we take it over directly, we would be the ones to contract directly with the organization.
So this money, this $290,550, would usually go towards IIAG enrollment,
To pay for our fees,
right?
yes.
And so this is no longer going to be the case. And then the reimbursement court clearance, GPD, and the Superior Court, there's 3,276, which equates, that was the quantity of the reimbursements for your court clearances, and from GPD and the Superior Court was 3,276 applicants at a price of $50 each, which equated to $163,800. So is this for the coaches or for the members?
Yeah, so I don't have the figures for what was actually expended last year, but what we try to do every year is ensure that we look to possibly increasing the stipend for coaches and reimbursing them for the cost of police clearances and whatever other fees that they incur. And these are for the individuals who are not currently employed with the DOE.
Okay. So you're reimbursing them for applying for the job. You're reimbursing them for
We're
the
trying to
requirements?
cover that cost, yeah.
Why don't you not reimburse them? If they want to apply for the job, they can apply for the job, and you can move that up for your coach's salary.
We can do that too.
I think that would be
Yeah.
a better route. If you want a job, you get the certifications you need, and then you apply for the job.
Well, part of it is we've understood that because the stipend has never really been increased for such a long time,
Right.
even the modest increase that we have now is still very little compared to the amount of time that is actually spent coaching.
Right.
So we really tried to support them as much as possible, and that was one of the options that we had.
So you're telling me by adding roughly $164,000 to increase coach pay, the coach's pay is not enough?
Still, yeah, in my opinion, no. Yeah, and just to be clear, we've actually never really gotten that approved before. The coaching stipend has been the same. I coached in 1993 after I graduated, and the varsity coach salary is the same.
Okay.
It's $1,260. So every year that we've tried to increase the amount, it's been unfortunate that we weren't able to do that. So really, we were really just trying to find ways to help support our coaches, because a lot of them are really, especially if they're younger and they don't work, and that's kind of the only job that they have.
I agree with you. They do need to get paid more, but I'm just trying to see some of the areas where you don't have to commit to cost, and you can use that cost for them.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll give you an opportunity to speak.
Okay.
Can you please state your name again for the record? I'm
Terry
sorry.
DeBold from IIAAG. Just for the record, I want to make sure that the committee understands that I'm not here to in any way influence any changes in the direction that GDOE has decided to go. In other words, and I have been working collaboratively with the superintendent and the other members within his group right now in terms of the transition. So yes, I received a letter, and we're proceeding as such, according to what you've learned in the third and fourth quarter. But just for the record, I want to make sure that it's clear and understood that as far as the funding is concerned, our records indicate the amount that GDOE has paid, and it hasn't changed too much year over year. It depends on the number of sports that are participating, that we have, the number of teams that are in those respective sports. But I think as of last year, it was around $129,000 total for IIAAG. That was GDOE's contribution. I'm looking at this now. It may have been less because that was kind of what we do is we provide every year a sole source budget to, as a vendor. We're a vendor. We provide a sole source budget, and that's just like they said, the officiating, facilities, other needs, for example, porta potties, anything you can think of, trophies, medals. We try to put all those things together, ambulances, like the first aid services, and then for each of the respective sports, based on the number of teams, in this case it would be 6 high school teams, and that would be the budget. Now perhaps they're combining middle school and high school, I'm not sure, but I'm just saying from the IIAAG high school standpoint, which I'm representing, it was around 129, may have been less, thousand, and we're looking at the same for this year as well.
So this is only for high school sports, you said?
Correct.
The 129.
I'm saying I can only speak for high school sports.
Right.
I'm not sure if they're combining high school and middle school. I'm just saying it was like
Sure.
around. Now, I understand that the Healthy Futures Fund, from what I saw, I believe in the bill, original bill was supposed to be like for this past year around $612,000 appropriation from the Healthy Futures Fund for GDOE sports. Interscholastic, specifically for the interscholastics, not including intramurals and PE and those things. It was $612,000. My real purpose here this evening, senators, is to. We're a local not-for-profit organization, 501c3. We've been here for 20 years. IIAAG is aware that GDOE receives an annual appropriation from the Healthy Future Fund for interscholastic sports. I'm here tonight to request that a separate appropriation from the Healthy Futures Fund be made for the IIAAG. These funds will help our continued efforts in achieving our mission to facilitate high school sports competition for all of our members and the student athletes throughout the island. So really I'm seeking your favorable consideration, or at least to consider looking at the budget out of the Healthy Futures Fund to appropriate a separate amount. Because I would not want to affect the direction that GDOE is going right now, but the IIAAG still serves a large portion of the community as well as GDOE students. We serve anybody and everybody. It's an open membership. And this is only going to help all the student athletes within the community. It's important to state that the IIAAG mission is to provide a sports league for its members, which are comprised of Guam high school students from GDOE, Guam Homeschool Association, and all the private schools, as well as now the charter schools. So we facilitate sports for any member. If there's a separate league, we'd still facilitate them for everybody. So I think it's only appropriate that there at least be consideration for an appropriation and being made.
Okay.
As speaking for some of the issues that they had mentioned concerning the hierarchy, and again, for the record, I was not there at the time on the board. I've been a member, I've been coaching since 1982. So I was there prior to IIAAG when it was still a GDOE league. I was there during the transition and throughout the IIAAG time. And again, I mentioned that there are people like Mr. Punzlan from JFK, Mr. Boudreau from GW have been there for years, probably for over a couple decades right now. Mr. Boudreau, sorry, Marty. But, and as a president, he was kind of tasked with having to deal with a lot of the grievances. And the hierarchy that they were mentioning, we, again, never received anything in writing, and in fact, we asked from the board standpoint, what are the specific issues? Please let us know so that we can address them. And it was during that transition that suddenly the decision had been made, so it was kind of like, okay, well, I guess that's the way it's going to be. We did not ever receive appointed like something that kind of said, okay, this is a problem, we'd like you to address these. As far as the hierarchy, though, The IIAG bylaws, ironically, are pretty much a copy and paste of the public school bylaws when the transition took place. So if you look at the current GDOE middle school bylaws, athletics, because GDOE middle schools they handle their own athletics. They were the same bylaws, the same grievance procedure, the process was the same. So if there is a problem with a hierarchy, I'm sure they're going to probably look at that and modify it. But we couldn't understand that because it was just something, again, we were somewhat perplexed.
So what role does IIAG play in the middle school level?
We don't.
Okay.
So it'll be the same. So right now, I think everybody is going to be able to coexist. I mean, I'm positive, and I've expressed that with them, that I think that we will be able to coexist. I think we'll be able to see interleague matches.
So you are asking for a separate appropriation for IIAG. If this is a nonprofit organization, just to be clear, right?
That's correct.
If your customers leave the organization, which would be GDOE leaving the organization, you wouldn't have to have the kind of capital required anymore to support IIAG, because you would again have to downsize that organization due to the transition.
That is correct. And so I modified the budget, and I'll provide copies to your committee.
So I don't
basically,
understand.
like I just mentioned, based on the GDOE budget that was provided for $129,000, which we copied again this year because it was for essentially the same sports, so we didn't really increase the rates. There's always an 8% increase, anticipated increase in costs over year because we're going from 19 to 20. Next year we'd be going from 20 to 21. So we kind of provide a 8% difference.
Increase. Okay.
But as opposed to the 129,000, I'm looking at roughly 88,000, which would facilitate, because there was a total of 14 high school members, of which 6 were GDOE. So there's still 8 high school members, schools with teams participating in these sports.
Yeah. So the other high school members pay their fees as well.
Yes, that's correct. Each school pays its own fee. So basically it comes from the families.
So like the parents pay for these fees?
Yes, so for example, the scheduling fee, which is the $450 just to be on the schedule, which is kind of a
complicated.
Deposit. I'm sorry.
Let's just stick to the keep it simple.
That's correct.
So 6 GDOE schools participate with IIAG.
That's correct.
8 other high school members participate with IIAG.
That's correct.
Are you asking, what are you asking? You're asking for an appropriation for IIAG for what? To cover the loss of 6 GDOE schools, or
No.
to help the 8 other high schools from the Healthy Futures Fund?
Yes, that's correct. To help the other 8 other high schools.
So where are the other high schools advocating for that?
Where are the other high schools?
Right, to be supplemented by the Healthy Futures Fund.
Where?
You're asking for money from the Healthy Futures Fund.
That's correct.
The IIAG.
As a not-for-profit.
Right, as a non-profit organization.
That's correct.
So if we provide you this money for
Yes.
8 other high schools,
Yes.
I'm thinking these are the private schools,
Yes.
right? That means that their fees should already be covered, so the parents wouldn't have to put forth that money, or the schools.
That's correct. Not only the private schools, you're talking about the charter schools and other schools,
Right.
that other members. Basically,
So
it's
are
for the
those
members.
stakeholders that you're advocating for, are they going to submit concerns and request an appropriation for this? I mean, I understand what you're getting at, but
I would ask them to, at this point right now, I'm just presenting this as from the IIAG high school standpoint, that I think it would be appropriate to consider appropriating those, in other words, providing the same funding, equitable funding. We're talking about all the students.
But then what if we provide the funding and then the high schools say, well, we don't want to go with IIAG either, we'll provide our own officials and referees and...
Then we would have to amend it. That's correct. Basically, okay, with the way that IIAG does it is we anticipate a certain budget at the beginning of the season. At the end of the season, the costs would change. In other words, it might be less, usually is less, because you may have not had as high of a cost for officiating or for the number of matches. So we only bill for the actual amount and end up at net zero. So in this case, we would have to basically say, okay, we had this amount left.
Okay. You see, this is a can of worms we're opening now.
I understand. I just believe that the Healthy Futures Fund is a public fund. I mean, based on the bill itself.
I agree with you.
And I think right now, I do not want to deviate from the current path that DOE's chosen to go. That's fine. And I certainly don't want to affect that. I'm just thinking that it should be treated as a separate matter.
Yes. I'm seeing that also because we also pay for the busing for the private schools for the Healthy Future Fund, right? And then that's for them to be bused to and from school. And then do we...
The Healthy Future Fund also supports nursing supplies as well, so it's not simply just for sports. So it is going to cover our high school, middle school sports, and then some of our the nursing supplies that we also need. So we can break that portion out and show you what we got for the last year.
Okay. So my concern is that pushing this agreement to supplement the 8 other high schools, the private schools, the charter schools, to supplement them through IIAG, that appropriation, the concern is, are the stakeholders involved in that request? Otherwise, I'm thinking, well, what if we don't want IIAG either? We want the Healthy Future Fund money to go directly to the school for our own interscholastic. So that's the kind of worms I'm talking about.
Yes.
So
I have spoken to the other stakeholders.
Yeah.
And the reason this came up is because I think this has been kind of in the back of the minds.
From all other 8 schools.
And the other schools have all said, well, actually, some of the schools weren't even aware of the Healthy Future Fund, the Healthy Futures Fund being used to support interscholastic sports. I mean, because even myself, I only learned about this past year.
Right.
I didn't know where the funding for interscholastics came from. And when it was brought to our attention, we were puzzled because basically it's split by 50%. So at the end of the day, if a game costs $500, we each pay $250 for the game. I'm not saying a game that costs that much. If it was only $50, each member pays $25. So at the end of the season, if it's $2,500 for volleyball season, say for instance, this school would pay $1,250, this school would pay $1,250. We didn't know that the Healthy Futures Fund was being used
for public school students.
Correct.
Okay.
And if it is, and if we understand the Healthy Future Fund correctly, then it seems only appropriate.
Right.
And so the only way to do that, if there's 2 separate leagues, would be to...
Sure. So I guess what I'm trying to say, or trying to hint at you, but I'll be more direct.
I have to get this.
Is let's get the high schools in here, the 8 other high schools, specifically requesting for that funding from the Healthy Futures Fund.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's appropriate. Thank you very much.
And whether they want it to go to IIAG,
yes,
then that's what you're here advocating for, or whether they'd like to put that money into their own scholastic, right?
That's fine.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President. Is there any other representative or constituent that would like to speak on this matter? Okay, Mr. Mead, I'll give you 5 minutes. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
I thought I'd give you 15 minutes of fame.
Could there be an agreement? Could you stop, just real quick, Mr. President of the IIAG, Duval, can you please come back to the table? Could there be an agreement that you improve the processes so that GDOE doesn't leave IIAG, or are we just fixed that we're only going to participate for the first 2 quarters and then we're going to start our own interscholastics?
We're a membership organization, so at any point, and we've discussed this before, basically we don't have a half-year membership, so it's $150 to be a member for the entire school year.
So you have to put all that money forward then?
Even
and only
though it's 2 quarters.
Okay, so you're going to pay for 4 quarters, Mr. Superintendent, and only participate in the first 2.
So yes, our intent is to participate and to fund our membership with IIAG.
So we're okay at any point. Let's say, for instance, if there was we have beach volleyball as a new sport coming up, and if for some reason GDOE said, well, we're not going to provide that sport, the GDOE students would be welcome to affiliate with any of the schools, or they could actually have a team if they wanted to.
Right, but that's not the issue here. We're not questioning being able to play in IIAG with other teams. The issue here is DOE is pulling out a IIAG. So I'm asking, are we going to find a compromise so that GDOE stays with IIAG, or is GDOE just going to move forward? They're completely unhappy with the services that IIAG provides.
I would just say, just out of respect for the board's decision, that the decision's been made, and I would say from my own perspective that I do think there are, I mean, not just addressing the deficit of the situation, you know, whether the disagreements might have been or disputes might have been. You know, Terry's been a good partner, and I want to keep that open communication going forward as to whatever that future possibility might be. But I do think there are some key opportunities to improve interscholastic sports, even if it's only for DOE schools, and, you know, I would hope we would move in tandem. But with regard to how we provide information to the community, what we do to plan the year in advance, how we approve pre- and post-season tournaments, really getting some clarity and discussion around student eligibility, how we handle parental disputes and grievances, making sure we're cognizant of Title IX requirements and gender equity requirements, and dealing with new issues like transgender requirements and other things. There are so many things that we haven't really discussed that I do think is appropriate for a department to, you know, with our responsibilities and obligations, to make sure we're tackling it and have that in place. And in the event that we move back, you know, in 2 years, back into tandem with IIAG, which I hope we don't separate fully. I mean, I hope we do have that competition, but I do think there are matters that we do need to, at least as a department, want to see addressed. So I think that was kind of the direction of the board. There are some things that seem to be, that come up every now and then, even if it's an issue or a perception of unfairness. Well, we want to just get clarity on that and make sure that we, you know, address that. I get complaints about private schools recruiting public school students, and, well, you know, whether there should be more constraints and limitations. You know, I don't mind entering this discussion about, you know, sharing appropriations, but, you know. But anyway, I guess just to say, there's lots of issues out there that, you know, we do want to work on. So, and I do think this will be an opportunity for the department to focus on those issues. And so I hope that we can keep the IIAG informed and work in tandem. And if we're all going in the same direction, maybe in a year or a couple of years, you know, the board will reconsider and think about that possibility. But for now, we're moving forward.
The decision has been made already,
yes,
to disconnect from IIAG for
correct,
interscholastics. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Mead, you have your 5 minutes, Mr. Mead. Please keep the decorum. Thank you.
It's unfortunate that the Guam Education Board has made a decision based on an uninformed position. I listened to all the questions you asked them, and I kept hearing the same old rhetoric, but I never heard a quantitative response. The quantitative response would be to pull all the minutes of all the, I'll say alphabet because I can't remember, of all their meetings where all of these supposed suspensions and things were done. On a historical note, is which I primarily bring to this table, is what created the alphabet in the first place. It was the inability of DOE to run the operation, plain and simple. I coached 3 sports. For 2 of them, I personally bought all the equipment. It wasn't purchased by DOE. I also refereed 3 sports. And as the treasurer of the MSOA, I on more than one occasion wrote letters to the superintendent and then director of DOE that if payment wasn't made, we were suspending all operations with DOE because we would be 2 sports behind in getting paid. So it scares me that we're going to use the funds and we're going to put it in a DOE budget because it was always there. Unfortunately, it's commingled with all the other funds. And if they need to pay the teachers, then guess who isn't going to get paid? The officials and the coaches and the athletic directors. Mr. Lujan, at the beginning of this whole thing, was fully in support of the alphabet. He promoted it, he supported it. And it's unfortunate that he's taken the stance that he has because of something that happened with one sport. One sport without substantiating the minutes of the alphabet to prove out that there was collusion or there was inequitable effects. I can remember the day when DOE was responsible. The board that reviewed all protests was made up of all the high school, middle school principals. If any concerned Ocean View High School, that's how far back I go, if the protest was filed by Ocean View, the protest was denied. And if the protest was filed against Ocean View, it was always upheld. Every single time. We talk about equity. Is that what's going to happen this time around? The fear I have is that for the last however long it's been, and it really bothers me that because the founding president of the Alphabet was Ed Brown, the AD at FD. His predecessors, those that followed him, was the AD, athletic director from George Washington, who held that position for who knows how many years, and then the athletic director of Simon Sanchez High School, Randy Kakigi, for so many years, and now Terry DeBold. How is it that if the president of this organization was an athletic director of DOE, someone is now saying they didn't have equity? That for some reason, the private schools were voting against them. Another comment that Mr. Lujan made was about grades and how unfair it is. Well, unfortunately, if memory serves, those grade requirements have been board policy for over 35 years, that you have to have a 2.0 to play. And I remember when I first coached softball at Ocean View, the first year, I had 4 kids that couldn't play because they didn't have grades. So I told them to go see their teachers for over the Christmas vacation. If there was anything they could do to bring their grade up, I didn't go see the teachers, I made them, so that they would qualify. You know what? They had the incentive. They went and did it. And by the end of the 3rd year, those sophomores and freshmen, every single one of them except one was on the B and A honor roll. So what's wrong with a 2.0 grade point average? The disparity is that in private schools, a C is a 2.6. So my son to play football had to have a 2.6, where everybody else from public school had a 2.0. And the Parent Association for FD, we bought all the equipment. We did the fundraising. We bought all the equipment for those kids. So don't think that that private schools are getting a free ride like they do with textbooks. They're not. Those parents have associations and groups that raise the money. Why? The last issue is busing. I didn't hear whether or not DPW is going to really truly, and the question wasn't answered when you asked. Is DPW going to go back to providing busing for all the DOE kids to go to all these athletic events or not? Because they stopped because the bus drivers were not getting paid the overtime. That's the question. So how are they going to, we talk about safety of their students. The rule was that if they didn't ride the bus, they didn't play the game. They couldn't participate. They weren't supposed to go in a private vehicle. But then DPW stopped providing the buses. And let me tell you, as a coach in those days, what a headache. Private schools, the parents pay for their busing or their transportation. So the disparity, don't let anybody kid you. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. The purpose and the reason and the founding behind the IIAAG actually provided a better opportunity and a better environment for kids' sports, because they were the ones when coaches didn't get paid, buses weren't paid, ADs didn't get paid, equipment wasn't bought. Those are the ones who suffered. As a former president for the Pop Warner Youth Football League, my comment always was, why is it that the parents are the ones that say it's for the kids and it's the adults that screw it up?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mead. Mr. Duvall?
Just for the record, I want to clarify one other issue concerning, I may have misstated, or regarding the middle school sports. So IIAAG does have middle school sports. There are, I think that's that's not among the 14 members. So there's a larger overall membership. I think there might be anywhere from 20 to 22 total members.
How about you provide that information for us concretely
Yes.
in a letter so that we can account for this and be accurate in the accounting for the measures, and then we can discuss seeing what we can do to help the other schools provide the funding source like we do for DOE
Yes,
for their interscholastics.
Okay, thank you. I
Yes.
just want to make sure that's clarified. Thank you.
So, but we do have double IAG in middle schools as well.
That's correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
That would be great. Thank you so much. I'd like to open it up for my colleagues if they have any questions or concerns. I know you have something. No? No? Okay. You don't want to see it for the record? Okay. It appears to me, Mr. Superintendent, that it's in the military what we call a hurt feelings report, that this decision was made to not go double IAG for the next year or two. I hope that you can come to the table, the board can come to the table. So I know this is not your sole decision, that the board can come to the table and work with double IAG in some of the areas that they feel were not equitable for DOE students. I feel that whether you go with double IAG or not, you're still going to have those same issues. You're going to have that hurt feelings report. Now, if it's an adult that gets the hurt feeling report that's probably a member of the board, then perhaps they need to change their mindset and remember why they're sitting on that board is to help the other student, is not to deal with whether his or her feelings got hurt during the process. And so hopefully there can be something amenable in the future. I still like to see public schools compete with private schools because this is something healthy for our students, you know, and it also keeps camaraderie with all the schools. Yes, the rivalry is very interesting, and it gets everyone involved and engaged, and it provides a sense of pride for the students. Also because the interscholastic sports, yes, we do give you a lump sum, but the Healthy Future Fund goes to provide for DOE, and so does the general fund. And so by that time, we are not accounting for supplementing the public schools for their part of the interscholastics sports that they do play. So, and if DOE does leave the membership, it would, in a world, put double IAG, impact their funding source, and also effectively trickle down to the other private schools or the other charter schools' participation as well. So if you can please consider that with the board, perhaps you can revisit that within the next month or so. I know you're super busy with school starting, but I think that it needs to be relooked if it was just an issue of adults not being able to agree on something, right?
Well, I just want to finish up by saying we do, again, I think as you can tell, we do plan to keep an open line of communication with our IIAG partners. You know, there really shouldn't, there's no secret agenda here. I think we all want to identify the issues that need to be clarified, and if we're working in tandem, I think that'll create an environment, you know, if for any future decision to change course. So we'll continue to do so and to keep you informed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Superintendent. I'd like to thank everyone that came here today, all members of the board, teachers, principals, and community members, and I'd like to thank my colleagues as well. We have exhausted all items on the agenda. It is now 7:15 in the evening. Thank you very much, and God bless.